Welcome to Lunching with Books. Today we are truly in for a treat. Dr. Joe Edd Morris will be reviewing his latest book, The Prison. And I must say that I read his first novel, Land Where My Fathers Died, and it was excellent. It was beautifully written, and I don't mean this wrong, but I was pleasantly surprised. I read a lot of books that could possibly be reviewed for Lunching with Books, but it was a great novel, and I'm looking forward to reading this. Joe Edd is a native of New Albany, and he's a graduate of Millsaps College and the Candler School of Theology at Emory, and he has his Ph.D. in psychology and is a practicing psychologist. And he wrote a column for the Journal for 40 years, which I enjoyed reading so very much. And he is the author of some other books, The Last Page, Revival of the Gnostic Heresy, Fundamentalism, 10 Things I Wish Jesus Hadn't Said, and his short fiction has appeared in a number of literary journals with a nomination for the Pushcart Prize. And also this book was noted by Amazon as being on the bestseller list for Southern fiction. So anyway, we are in for a real treat, and we're so fortunate to have him in our midst. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank each of you for coming today. It's always an honor to be here. There's someone else I want to thank that without her in my life, I might not be up here, because she played a significant role in my development. She taught me, she's going to fuss at me for telling you all this, but she taught me English. She was my English teacher in New Albany. And she also taught me public speaking. And Frances Sheffield, I'm deeply indebted to her. She infused all of her students with a desire to learn. She taught us about excellence. She expected excellence. And I'm hoping that I delivered today, Frances. Thank you for being here.
I want you all to know that I take full credit.
Well, I haven't finished yet. All right, okay. Well, I've often said I'm probably the most unaccomplished published fiction writer you've ever met. I've written 17 novels, and only 3 of them have been published, and one of them we're here today to talk a little bit about. But instead of talking about this book, I would like to take you on a journey of how this book came to be. I would like to focus more on the process of writing than the finished product. I've often said that happiness is in the process, not in the finished product. That's why we keep writing, isn't it? Because we love doing that. So I want to talk about where it began. I was born in New Albany, Mississippi, the birthplace of William Faulkner. I grew up 3 blocks from where he was born. You would think that my family's connection with Faulkner and the Faulkner family, you would think that with the best English teacher a person could hope to have, that my fingers would have been hitting the typewriter keys and the ribbon would have been flowing and the pages would have been leaping from the carriage. But it didn't happen that way. Not there and not then. In 1961, I was appointed by the North Mississippi Conference to be the associate pastor of the Drew Methodist Church in the Delta. I'd never been in the Delta. I transferred from Ole Miss to Delta State, and I was smitten by this Delta. It had a unique ambiance about it, a certain mystique. The soul of the land was different, and I just was taken by it. And I remember one night I was in the Delta State Library. The window was up, a nice balmy breeze was blowing. I could see a full moon rising, and I was inspired. I had, besides term papers, I had never written anything in my life. I decided I was going to write a poem. We had been studying sonnets in Dr. Butler's literature class and the structure of sonnets and all of that. So I tried to write a sonnet. 14 lines, 3 quatrains, iambic pentameter, the rhyme schemes working. And I put something together. And I had been inspired actually by one written by Wordsworth called "Nuns Fret Not at Their Convent Walls," which interestingly enough foreshadows another thing I would write 50 years later, the prison. Nuns fret not at their convent walls. So I wrote this sonnet, and I tinkered with it a little bit, make sure it was okay. And I wanted to show it to somebody, but I didn't want to show it to my left brain, grammatically syntactical correct English teacher. I would have shown it to you, Francis. So I walked across the quadrangle to the art building and wanted to share it with my art teacher. I was taking an art appreciation class, and his name was Malcolm Norwood. Malcolm Norwood went on to become a prominent artist in our state. His works are in a lot of museums and in Jackson and other places. And with trembling hand, I shared this little sonnet with him. And he looked at it. He looked up. He looked back down at it. I didn't see a smile. He said, He said, I like this. Can I keep it? Can you leave it with me? And I said, well, sure, I'm not going to give it to anybody else. So months rolled on, and I forgot about it. About a year later, I encountered him crossing the quadrangle again, and he said, Joe Edd, come by my office. Oh, no, he said, can you come by my office? I went to the office a lot in school, so I was anxious. I wasn't sure what I'd done. So I went over to the office, and he had splayed on his desk, there was this magazine. And he walked in, and he flipped it over where I could see the front of it, Delta Review. It's a literary magazine. He flipped it back open and pointed, and there was my little poem, Summer's Retreat by Joe Edd Morris. I cannot tell you what I felt like in that moment. I felt 10 feet tall, but the fire fell, the writing fire fell. So I started writing poems, and they weren't very good poems, and I knew that, but I was writing and I was enjoying it. It was good to be doing that. I got 2 of them published, and then it just kind of dropped off, and I had other things to do and got involved in seminary and writing long papers and things like that. So I spent a year above the Arctic Circle as a chaplain on the U-line. That was put up in the Eisenhower administration. There were radar sites every 100 miles, and my job was to monitor the morale of the people up there. And I had to get from site to site, and I would hitchhike with Royal Canadian Mounted Police in their little planes, and I would hitchhike with the oil people in their planes because it was my job to do that. It was like a circuit rider. But it was very lonely, profoundly lonely, and I started writing again. And I started writing about my personal experiences in my hometown and growing up, and I was impressed with a poem that I had read by Robert Frost. The title of it was Come In. And one of the lines drew my attention, and it says, far in the pillared dark, thrush music came like a call to come in. And I thought about my call to the ministry, and I thought about that time of call. I thought about other types of calls. I thought about the pillared dark. I thought about the pillared churches and the pillared mansions and the pillared halls of government and the pillared backwoods. I thought I could work this theme. So I laid it out. I started working on it. Came back to Mississippi. Got involved in other things. And it just it was there, but I wasn't really working on it. Then somebody came into my life who was a former English teacher, and she liked what I was writing. She read some of it. And I was telling her about this pillared dark theme, all this intricate stuff, all these convolutions and structure and all that. And Sandy said to me, "Joe Edd, just tell the story." And actually, she said that again to me when I was writing Land Where My Fathers Died. I was getting too bogged down in a bunch of stuff, and she said, "Just tell the story." Well, the story I started working on then was one called Coming for to Carry Me Home. I changed the title of The Pillared Dark to Coming for to Carry Me Home, and Francis Patterson entered my life. And Francis says, "Joe Edd, you need to meet Evans Harrington." I said, "Oh, who's Evans Harrington?" "He's the head of the English department at Ole Miss." "Oh, okay." So she got my manuscript transported to Evans, and Evans read this Coming for to Carry Me Home. And he and I met on the porch of Square Books, but that porch is no longer there now. But we met overlooking the square, and I'm just sitting there thinking, boy, this is wonderful, this is wonderful. And then the hammer falls. He said, "Joe Edd, this was an okay novel, but this was the novel that you had to write to learn how to write a novel." So I asked him, I said, "Well, do you mind if I take this back and rework it a little bit?" And he said, "No, that's fine, you can do that." So I took it for another month or so, and I reworked it, and I had my outtakes, the things I took out, and I made a separate manuscript of the outtakes so that I handed back to him two manuscripts. One was the manuscript proper, which was the story, and the other one was the outtakes. Sandy was with me, actually. We were over at their home, and a friendship developed out of all of this. And he said, "Well," he said, "this is okay, but I really thought that some of the stuff you were taking out was better than the stuff that you were leaving in." Well, anyway, I started another novel. We get our novels from interesting places. I was talking to this guy who was from Tippah County, and I asked him where he was from, and he said, "I'm from the Weaning Hill." I said, "What?" He said, "The Weaning Hill." "What is the Weaning Hill?" He said, "Well, it's a little hill." And he told me the directions, and I won't go into all of that. But he said, my family would allow each of their children to settle on the Weaning Hill and farm the land around it. And then once they were on their feet, they had to move off, and the next couple come in and take the Weaning Hill. So you can bet I'm writing this stuff down, you know. So I wrote a novel about dependence and interdependence and codependency, and with the land and with couples, with each other, with families. And I think Sandy thinks it's one of her favorites and probably one of the best ones I've written, but it didn't catch any eye. It was, the agent said it was too quiet. Well, so that means I need to get a little more action in it. So my next novel was based on a personal experience at Northeast. The title of it was Murder in the Dorm. That's kind of a catchy title, isn't it? Kind of like a little action. And it was based on the death in one of the dorms. This girl was bludgeoned by a drill rifle. And I was a teacher on campus and also a psychologist, and I had helped the law enforcement with some forensic hypnosis and some other cases. And so they wanted me to help with this one. The bottom line is I ended up writing a novel out of the whole thing and shopped it around to agents, and they liked it. Some of them liked it. And then I also started getting phone calls people knew I was writing this manuscript, this story. And I didn't like some of the people who were calling me asking for the manuscript. Bottom line, I pulled it. I just didn't want to deal with a lawsuit. So that's sitting on the shelf. Now, the next time I wrote, the next novel was Land Where My Fathers Died. And the first published novel. And I thought I would write a sequel to it called Inherit the Land, and I got carried away and wrote another one called The Will, so I had this wonderful trilogy that nobody was interested in. So that's sitting on the shelf, and I dropped on and went on to something else. I've been a jury consultant, so I wrote a novel about that called The Jury Consultant, and the jury consultant's wife gets put on the jury panel, and it has some interesting twists and everything. But that didn't make the cut either. Y'all getting tired listening to all this? So then I decided, well, let's back up. Sandy and I were having dinner one night at Country Kitchen. It used to be over on Lawndale with Phyllis Harper. And Phyllis started telling this story about a lady over in 20 Mile Bottom who disappeared, and they thought she was thrown down a well, but it was never fully investigated for some nefarious reasons. And I'm sitting there copying furiously on 5x5 napkins what everything Phyllis is telling me. I still have those napkins, and if that book ever sees the light of day, it's going to be dedicated to Phyllis Harper. But it's an interesting story. Roy Ryan took me over 20 Mile Bottom. You from that neck of the woods. And we stopped and we visited with the sheriff who investigated that crime and found out other interesting things. And I'm writing copious notes again, you know. So I eventually get this thing written. No, I got to back up. Shortly after that, I went to a workshop in Jackson, Mississippi for disability examiners, which I was one at the time. And I heard this guy tell about Tarleton County, Georgia, that there was disability fraud you wouldn't believe because there were 500 people, 500 cases of schizophrenia in this one county. Neil, you get a kick out of this. But anyway, I took Tarleton County and I lifted it up and I plopped it down in 20 Mile Bottom. And I introduced a gypsy queen who became the queen bee of the fraud. And they have it investigated, and it's really interesting. I thought I would try to entertain you with an excerpt from it. You think that might work? Not. I got time. This is from the first chapter of 20 Mile Bottom, and there's also a very sick theology that's at the basis of all of this. Let me give you an idea of the theology. Roy Jean Province was brought up believing in hell. Hell was a place of fire and brimstone where people went when they died if they weren't saved. It had also been drummed into him by his granddaddy Excel, his mama's daddy, and hog farmer turned preacher, that there was a hell on earth and it was called work. If you worked, clearly stated as being productive or having a job, you were living in a state of sin and unsaved. When you died, you only went from one hell, one hot field or factory, to one 1,000 times hotter. The only folks in world history who never worked were Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the first and only true heaven. Did I hear it? Amen? There, the ground was not cursed. Nobody crawled on their stomach and ate dust. Nobody sweated by their brow or felt shame. They were saved and in a state of divine grace. Otherwise, they were working and living in sin, which meant hell. You told me not to get into theology. I've been told not to get too theological. Not only was working a sin, but his granddaddy Excel said, a person who worked paid taxes to the federal government, which was like giving money to Satan. U.S. stands for Uncle Satan. his granddaddy said. Uncle Satan takes and he don't give. If you don't believe me, just look around you. The only way to beat that devil is to take from him when he ain't looking. Ain't that stealing, Granddad? No, boy, that ain't stealing. Taxation stealing. What I'm talking about is garnishing what was yours to start with. We done worked. We paid our dues. It's time to collect. Time to chip in on God's grace. We earned it. All right. Then we come to greater love. Now, the last page is about the last page of Mark's Gospel and why there's not a resurrection story there. And it's a mystery. It was my first attempt at a mystery, and it ended up turning into a thriller. And it's one. If someone asked me what novel did you have the most fun writing, that would be it, probably, because I didn't. With my theological background, I could go right straight to the page. I didn't have to do a lot of research, though I did a considerable amount. And then after that, it was published, by the way. That's one of the three. After that was one called Greater Love. You remember the pillar dark back there? Coming for to carry me home? All this morphing into something else. All of that ended up into Greater Love. And it's one of my favorites, and we'll see if it gets published. The bottom line is we have fun writing these things. And then there is The Prison. The Prison is a sequel to Land Where My Fathers Died. I'm going to evoke Evans Harrington's name again because I got the idea. We get our ideas from unusual places. The Spirit moves where it will. We're sitting out on our guest house porch with Evans and his wife Betty. And Evans is telling me this story about a Confederado who's looking for his kin somewhere south of the border. And he figures that they're in Brazil somewhere. And so he does his research and he goes to Pau Salo, and out from that finds a small village, gets the right street, the right house, knocks on the door, and the door cracks open, and this wizened face looks out, and she asks what he wants in Portuguese. And he tells her in English who he is. And she opens the door, and she said, "Well, why didn't you say so? Y'all come on in." That was just a beautiful little snippet right there that I thought had some promise. And from it came Land Where My Fathers Died. And just briefly read to you one passage from that. Joe Shelby has reached his destination. He's found his great-great-aunt, and he has the letters with him that helped him find her. And she took the letters, adjusting herself as she were missing her bifocals, and read. He watched the pale hazel eyes move slowly down each page, watched them widen and the pupils grow larger, and her mouth open and drop further open, and the wrinkles spread out over the amazed face until she was finished, and her hands and the papers in them collapsed in her lap. "Well, I'll declare," she said, "if that don't beat all." The accent was there, along with the idiom, the homegrown phraseology passed down through the generations of his parents and theirs before them, and further back still, and all but voiced once more, an echo blown down the canyon of years, and he trembled at its sound and smiled. And she took out the towel and wiped his face, brushed away the tears that came unhurried down his bruised cheeks. Let me read to you a little bit here from The Prison. I keep looking for my watch and it's right there. That's not good. Shell Ferguson drove slowly along the stretch of blacktop, his eyes focused on the curious shapes ahead. He had lived his entire life in the Mississippi Delta, but never fully adjusted to its flatness. The endless monotony had a haunting way of playing tricks on his eyes. The midday sun shone brightly in the clear blue dome, but not warmly. It was late November, Thanksgiving Day, and cold. 2 months before, he would have seen rows of cotton and soybeans flicking by in geometrical precision, acres of milo and wheat and rice. Now, drab fields of stubble stalks lay busted in disk, bleak and barren. Along the hedgerows and creek banks, shattered trees scratched the sky. He crossed old bridges over old rivers, serpentine across the alluvial plain. He passed gum-choked bayous and stands of cypress along channels of sloughs, motionless black water going nowhere. No music from this flat-lined land, as if time was in limbo, if it had stopped and was waiting to be time again. Dawns were always better for him than dusks, and there was nothing like the Delta at dawn, nothing like it anywhere. That first flush of light on the horizon, straight as if God had laid down a ruler and drawn it. The first shaft shooting upward from behind it like a bomb going off on the other side of the world, firing the clouds jonquil and pink and orange until the whole eastern sky seemed afire. Then the first cusp of light, old as time, bright as a welder's arc, bulging into the fading dark, its rays streaking across the flatness, and you seeing them before anybody else in the world, before they struck beaches or ocean waves or touched the tops of the great mountains, because there was nothing in between to stop them. As they raced that straight and true across the earth, that pure and unobstructed and undefiled. By the way, Shell had his name changed, in case some of you picked up on that. He was Joe Shelby, and after my father's died, but he married Athens, his sweetheart, and she told him he needed to change his name, and he wondered why. And she says, well, for starters, Joe is a girl's name. And secondly, it's the name of a Confederate general, and that's not the thing now. And so he decided, she said, you should call yourself Shelby. Well, he didn't want to call himself Shelby because that was a pintle farm in Memphis and a one-horse town in the Delta. So he didn't like that. So he decided on Shell because Shell was something that protected. It was also something that was empty in this story. But his grandson's in prison. This is a scene. It was dark in the cell when Cal opened his eyes, only meager reflected light from the outside security and indoor pod lights that burned 24/7. A loud buzzer had signaled the 3 o'clock count. Each time he awakened in the cool, empty solitude, smells of body odor, feces, urine, and flatulence assaulted his nose as his vision reconstructed the world around him, his eyes colliding first with the black steel bunk overhead before the rest of his small world fell into place. He'd been there a week, but it seemed like years. In that brief skin of time, you'd think he'd know where he was when he woke up. When he got out in 20 years, would his senses have to readjust all over again? Prison life so stamped upon them. In his world of sheltered grief and solitary anger, he's lost his wife and daughter in a fire. Did it even matter where he was when he woke up, as long as he woke up? He kept hoping each time he went to sleep he would awaken and like a fever breaking the pain would go away. But each time he awakened he was slammed anew by grief, by memories powering up from the darkness within. He kept waiting to hear the sound of his soul, but nothing came from that dark night. Towards the end, they end up across the levee, and that's all I want to tell you. I don't want to mess it up for anybody. Through the gloom of canebrake and dormant wood and shadow, the first thing Cal saw was the oxbow, some ducks skimming the surface, quacking. The voices he had been hearing were louder. He He smelled coffee and caught a whiff of frying bacon. Then the sun came smoking up through the mist over the levee behind him, the moving edge of the levee's receding shadow, falling lower, a dark blade, sliding incrementally, revealing the world in new light. Just a couple more here. This is at the end. Shell's having a discussion with Cal, and have you thought about what you might do once you're exonerated? Shell attempted. After a long delay in answering, Cal said, I've thought about it. Everything's been swirling around in my mind like a merry-go-round. I need to get off, but can't. You can when it stops, Shell said, and it will eventually stop. Time is on your side. Time, Cal sighed with a single nod, then uttered the word again and nodded again. Time is what I was serving. I'm out and still feel like I'm serving it. We're all serving time, son. If you're living, you're serving time. Time is God's other name. You can't get around that big clock. Cal looked at him. That should be my line. I'm the preacher. Glad you still feel that way. You kept the faith. You survived. A pause. Cal thinking. Then, I don't think I survived because I kept the faith, whatever that means. Sounds like protective custody. That if you hang on to it long enough, God will bail you out. I survived because he sat there, molars grinding, jaw muscles rippling, rolling his hands as if the movement spun the rest of the thought. Shell sensed him struggling. What you're trying to tell me, Cal, is that faith doesn't sit on its haunches and wait. It has legs. Cal, Granddad, you're amazing, Cal said, looking at him with bright eyes. At the end of the novel, there's a afterward where I tell about what happened to the key individuals. And I'm just going to close with that, just a few lines. Any of you ever eaten at the Ranchero in Clarksdale? Y'all need to go to Ranchero. The Ranchero continues to serve its famous barbecue as it has since 1959. The levee along the Mississippi River still rivals the Great Wall of China. The levee road continues to serve as a travel option for the adventurers who want to drive on it from Illinois to Louisiana. The Mississippi Delta is as flat and endless as ever and will always be the Delta. The prison is everywhere. And the fire still falls, doesn't it, Peggy? Thank y'all for having me here today. We got time for some questions. If
Joe Edd, I think we would all be interested to know about your experience in the two prisons in which you served recently as chaplain.
well, it was actually a psychologist, but I took on a chaplain's role, believe me. In fact, I was ministered to by the prisoners more than I was ministering. And one of the key characters in this story, whose name is Jose, that's not his real name, he's a real person, and I met him in one of the prisons. And we still get letters from him. Sandy made the comment earlier to someone that getting a letter from Jose. Well, Jose is not his name in the book. That's his real name. Well, anyway, she said reading one of his letters is like reading a letter from Paul. But he has an international faith intercessory prayer mission. He sends letters out. And what's interesting is he's been in several different private prisons. I met him in Tutwiler, the private prison there. But he's worked his way back to California where his family is. And each time the wardens let him keep his typewriter because they're impressed with what he's doing. He's in for armed robbery, a bank, with a firearm. And he's one of the most beautiful people I think I've ever met, anyway. But I was a psychologist, and my job was to pay particular attention to suicide prevention, suicide attempts, to monitor morale. And I'm thinking, I was at Marshall County facility and did pretty much the same thing there. I'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, which was when I was getting up anyway to write, so it didn't bother me, and I would drive down and I'm back home by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So it wasn't too bad. The stressful part of it was dealing with administration, with MDOC, and with the people over the private prisons. And the private prisons had to answer to MDOC. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted everyone to know that his books will be for sale and he's donating the proceeds of the sale to the library. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Buy lots of books. Anything else? Well, Francis, how did I do? Thank you all very much.